presentation, The Hidden Traditions of Ajijic. Eduardo Ramos Cordero and Phil Rylett are going to present. There are so many wonderful Ajijic traditions which are very visible, but there are others that we either don't see or simply don't understand what is happening. Eduardo, affectionately known in the village simply by the nickname Lalo, will recount those traditions that have survived and are still practiced today, sometimes discreetly and sometimes hidden in plain sight. Lalo is Ajijic's cronista, a title given to those who are charged with keeping the stories of the pueblo. As a teenager, he recognized that many stories of the older folk might disappear, so he collected them. He also organizes the Easter Passion Play, as well as many lesser-known events. He has revived many traditions lost to the past, so please join us next week. Doesn't that sound really cool? Always so great. It fits in nicely with today's presentation. This week's presentation is by Ed Tasca, and we have a nice crowd, so I know many of you know him. The Puzzling Dissonance of Mexican National Identity. This presentation is about how Mexico became Mexico, the story of Hernan Cortes and the essential events that created what we now know as Mexican culture and national character. It is a nation that is uniquely Hispanic, but has rejected its Hispanic identity for over 500 years, while stubbornly clinging to a rich indigenous culture and roots. Ed Tasca is from Philadelphia. You're going to hear it in his voice. His humor has been published in the US, Canada, Mexico, England, Italy, Australia, and Norway. Ed has been writing a humor column for the Guadalajara Reporter since 2016. Ed has also worked as an actor at Lakeside Little Theater, where he performed his own one-man show, Mark Twain, that was amazing, called Uncensored, and had another feature play performed at their stage. Please join me in welcoming Ed.
Thank you all. Oh my God, it works. In the event of an earthquake, I'll be under the table on the pavilion. I know we've dealt with it before, but it always comes as a shock, and we've had a couple of quakes over the last couple of days, so let's hope we don't have any today. Now, this presentation, I would like everybody to try to think of it as a kind of a movie, because that's how I see it. I see it as a movie. So, sorry? Is that better? Is that good? That's better? Okay. Recently, we saw the passing of a beloved British queen. It was only maybe a week or so ago. It was a mournful experience for many, but within days there was this backlash about the wrongdoings of colonization from formerly colonized nations. It's a world history. This presentation about Mexico's origin story is another, but somewhat unique version of the imperial expansionism and supremacy of monarchy. There's a politically correct notion these days that we have to go back and look at our histories, especially in the free world, and to attempt to make amends for the actions of our nation's founders and heroes. We take down statues, we rewrite histories, include all the flaws and the misdeeds of historical figures, and we reshape our entire views of the past. We even ask for reparations for perceived wrongdoings, as in Mexico's recent appeal to Spain by AMLO. Well, the problem with this, as you already know, is that we are applying today's mores, customs, values, and worldviews to the peoples of the past. They even have a word for it now. It's like a pseudoscience, presentism. Presentism, yes. Meaning that we should be looking at everything in the past with views of, our views of the present. Does it make sense? That's my question. For example, should the Romans of today bear responsibility for what ancient Rome did to transform the tribes they conquered and enslaved? Should the Russians ask Mongolia to pay up for the genocides committed by the Mongols who helped create a Russian nation 1,200 years ago? Mexico and its founding 500 years ago is a story of two distinct ethnicities, clashing and then conjoining and then congealing as one ethnicity. For me, it speaks of the ancient paradigms of how all of today's ethnicities actually began and moved civilizations along through history. Most nations can pinpoint their conception out of whatever historians at the time had concocted it to be. And most can find some evils attached to that conception. It's just the way history played out during the age of conquest, slavery, persecution, and other horrors we stigmatize in today's world, but which were pragmatic and commonplace ancient standards. 500 years ago, Mexico experienced a seismic transformation in every possible way, culturally, religiously, linguistically, economically, and of course racially. This was not the first time such an existential upheaval of this magnitude overtook a people and their way of life. But Mexicans today refuse to celebrate or even acknowledge that transformation, or find any good in it at all, because of the widespread manslaughter and humiliation of the land's original peoples by the Spaniards. This has caused a strange identity dissidence, or at least an ambiguity around national identity here. On the one hand, Mexicans are who they are as a result of their recorded post-Hispanic history, and on the other hand, they do not want to be identified with it. That's what mystifies me, and that's why this presentation. Neither the government nor the people, while proud and nationalistic, show any particular honors to the nation's Spanish interventions, even though the influences are everywhere. Columbus and his discovery of the Caribbean islands, and by extension the Americas, is celebrated all over Mexico, even though he never even got here. He didn't even know it existed. And we have streets named after him. I suppose it's because he was not tainted by the conquistadors' wars here with the native peoples. In other words, not getting here was an advantage. In 1517, little-known Hernandez de Cordova, sailing from Cuba, landed on what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, following along in scrabbled fashion of the voyages of Columbus, and at footfall, like Columbus, he maintained that this land was another island of the Indies. Bernal Diaz de Castillo was the chronicler who gave us the only contemporaneous account of most of what took place when the Spanish reached Yucatan. Cordova failed within weeks to settle here, a land he called New Spain. He encountered fierce pitched battles with the local Mayans, was seriously wounded, returned to Cuba on the next boat out, died a few months later of his wounds, and earned a footnote in history. It would be 2 years later when another man, would venture into New Spain. His mission was Catholic conversion and benign engagement with the native peoples. Not surprisingly, he too would find himself at war, first with the Mayans and many of the other fractured tribes in the area, and eventually with the powerful Aztec Empire. This man was Hernan Cortes. Cortes, by most accounts, was a superb statesman, leader, and military tactician. As well as a devout Catholic, Cortes attempted to follow what were called his nation's and his church's precepts of engagement, which were much more humanitarian and principled than history gives him credit for. According to William H. Prescott's History of the Conquest of Mexico, there were 30 rules given to Cortes by Cuba's governor Velázquez before Cortes set out to this new land. Among the 30 rules was one point that recurred with considerable emphasis: the requirement to avoid harming innocent inhabitants, their livelihoods, their property, and their women. It's like Star Wars. I mean, it's the same Star Wars, do no harm. Hello, Gene Roddenberry. With such a set of formal humanitarian rules, Cortes arrived in Mexico, hoping the primitives would witness an obviously superior culture, and that the native people's assimilation into it would be fluid and peaceful. Presumptuous? Yes, it was. It never happened. Not because of aggression, but because of the Spaniards' bizarre religious teaching, which went this way: the natives must be converted to Catholic doctrine to be in God's favor. So far, so good. But then they were also told that as converts and believers in this God, they were automatically guilty of terrible sins and were going to burn in hell forever. That's a tough one to buy. Needless to say, the poor natives weren't so sure of the logic of this. Still, while determined to maintain his allegiance to Governor Velázquez's rules and remain a pious disciple of Christ, he needed to get this mission accomplished. It was top priority. To that end, he could not resist the practicality of warfare. And so, conversion, as nonsensical as it was, often required use of force. Now, this oppressive Catholic doctrine and the bad communication skills set Cortes on a course for notoriety that would last to today. Despite Cortes' initial cautions and his bizarre conversions, the territories into which he advanced were tribal strongholds whose warriors interpreted Cortes' march as an invasion, naturally. The resultant native military musters vastly outnumbered his own. His small military expedition into the Ukraine was about 500 men and 16 horses. This was more evidence that in 1519, he really expected no war. He really expected to walk in and give everybody a blessing, and they would all fall to their knees and genuflect, and everybody would be happy. That didn't happen. Cortes' army tried to ply the Mexican tribes with goodwill and an honest proclamation to do good things. Those good things included, one, freeing the people of their heathen beliefs so they didn't burn in hell, and two, to trade for mutual satisfaction, which meant various trinkets and some extraordinary new weapons in exchange for the land's gold. Why just gold? I'm sure that's what the natives were thinking. Why just gold? According to the Spanish, the gold was needed in large quantities as a heart medication. Every invader had a heart disease. I'm guessing these Spaniards went around groaning with chest pain to elicit these deep sympathies. It was a total scam. Gold, as an early form of statins and blood pressure meds, it worked. The natives sympathized and gold poured forth, and no one was going to hell. But the natives all had good, strong hearts, and were going to live for a long time. But suspicions didn't matter. There was also resistance to this whole gold hoarding scheme. I guess nobody was having heart attacks, and all these Spanish heart patients were spending 18 hours digging all over the countryside with heart conditions. Something didn't feel like a medical emergency. Okay, this wasn't working politically. So to achieve his ends, Cortes took advantage of tribal rivalries. He advanced inland from Yucatan towards the fabled city of Tenochtitlan. Do I have that right? Gracias. That's Mexico City's city center today. This was the seat of the Mexican Empire and the godlike Montezuma, although it wouldn't be called Mexico for another 300 years when it was finally decolonized from the Spanish. Mexica is another name for the Aztec people. In addition to his military alliances, Cortes had the aid of superior armaments and technology, to say nothing of his army's immunity to smallpox. Another advantage the natives didn't have. And over time, they were falling victims in large numbers, the natives. So the stage was set for a conquest. But the key point of the presentation here is that Cortes and his soldiers rarely attempted to subjugate the people they came to dominate. From the very start, they bred with the natives. They settled within their communities in a 16th century form of egalitarianism. Some, you know, not everybody was very happy. But Cortes was not yet the historic conquistador history called him, despite his subduing resistances to his advances, his incursions, and his attempts at, incursions and his attempts at conversions. Here's what changed things. After winning a battle against the local tribe in Tabasco, Cortes's spoils of war included a beautiful Aztec slave. This is where my movie comes in. Beautiful Aztec slave. She was believed to be about 15 years old, who had previously been captured by Mayan-speaking people and had learned the Maya language as well as other tribal languages. As an Aztec slave, some contemporaries insist she was a noble woman. We really don't know for sure. Her own language was Nahua, which, is that right? Nahua, the tongue of Montezuma's empire. Cortes employed this native linguistic treasure to expedite communications with territorial chieftains he could not communicate with before, except through clumsy sign language that was generally misinterpreted. For example, while clumsily trying to request the whereabouts of local gold mines, Cortes's subordinates did little but make awkward gestures of digging into the ground. The natives had no idea what they wanted, and they responded by showing the invaders how to plant corn. Made sense to me. The Aztec slave girl, or noble woman, single-handedly changed all of this. And she was able to learn Spanish in what must have been less than a year, which added to her fluency and familiarity with at least 4 distinct Mexican languages. This all totaling 5 distinct languages, and she was still a teenager. She was brilliant. Soon she rose, obviously, from slave girl to interpreter. Not long after, Cortes also made her diplomat to all the tribes that neighbored his domain. And then, as a fairy tale might go, to paramour and royalty. This brought a cohesion that was rare for the region and the times. These were the first steps to creating the mixed race, common language, and culture and religion that defines Mexico today. Her name, Doña Marina. So successful was she that Cortes and his brilliant consort became the first Mexican family. Still with high ambitions, Cortes was ready to march on the Mexican capital and Montezuma, a sort of military parade. It was to be a show of strength and influence, but still with peaceful intentions. Within a few weeks, he gained a diplomatic foothold in the city by impressing Emperor Montezuma with his vast coalition of tribal allies, his own superior weapons, and more importantly, his secret weapon. Now, the tribute Cortes was receiving in the form of gold, still coming, it was still coming in big numbers, but it, wasn't enough anymore. Even though the Spaniards' heart disease still hadn't been cured, no matter how much gold they were wearing, they were still, I guess, grunting and groaning. Cortes was now about to fire off his secret weapon. It was his greatest weapon. Aided by the persuasive communicative skills of Doña Marina, historians argue that Cortes's greatest ploy was pretending to be Quetzalcoatl, the white-faced god the Aztec peoples had long been waiting to return. If any conquistador ever had the perfect secret weapon, this one topped them all, including the Trojan horse. It was not unlike Alexander the Great's claim to be the son of Egypt's greatest god. As Mel Brooks might say, it's good to be the god. After some weeks in Tenochtitlan, Cortes, with his grand and godly curriculum vitae and his tribal anti-Montezuma allies, seized the opportunity, betraying his friend Montezuma and taking him hostage so that he, Cortes, might govern the empire with Montezuma as a figurehead. But as the new capo, Cortes had problems. He needed to feed and govern not just a band of Spaniards, but thousands of Mexican allies, rivals to Montezuma. Disease, some drought, and of course the Catholic conversions created a strain, and the domestic failures began to weigh on the city. Fears of revolt seemed just around the corner. Not just from Montezuma's followers, but from Cortes's tribal allies as well. Just things weren't going well within the city. Cortes convinced the population that as God, he alone could care for everyone's concerns. We've heard something like that. But as fate and a good screenplay would have it, news reaches Cortes that a much larger party of Spaniards had been sent by the Cuban governor Velasquez to arrest Cortes for insubordination and worse, mutiny. I suppose this was, had a lot to do with the number of skirmishes and minor warfare that went on before he reached the capital. So he mustered and marched to the coast, where he defeated the Cuban arrest party and enticed the defeated soldiers to join him with stories of the city of gold, recommending, I'm sure, a fake arrhythmia here or there. With Montezuma a vassal and Cortes fending off the Spanish authorities, good fortune seemed to embrace Cortes at every turn. The bloodbath, though, that he sought to avoid at the nation's capital came to pass when the lieutenant he left in charge, as he went to face the authorities from Cuba, had massacred large numbers of the Aztec nobility, including innocent civilians and holy men. And the massacre, as it turned out, was based on nothing but empty rumors. Paranoia. No rebellion was afoot. Nonetheless, this was the beginning of Cortes's reputational demise. Angry survivors quickly elected a new emperor, Cuitlahuac. And even he doesn't know. Cuitlahuac replaced Montezuma, who had lost popular support for welcoming the Spaniards into the city in the first place. Cuitlahuac took revenge. He ordered his soldiers to attack the palace housing the ranking Spaniards. The bloodshed changed everything. Cortes was no longer in the same position of power. He asked Montezuma, who was still his figurehead, to speak to his people and persuade them that the soldiers responsible would be punished and to let the Spanish remain in their settlements without further bloodshed. Montezuma did exactly as requested, but was jeered and stoned by his own people. Loyal to the end, according to Spanish accounts, Montezuma was mortally injured during this act of diplomacy and died a few days later. So much for diplomacy. By these recorded accounts, Cortes had little to do with the misguided opening salvos of the interracial war and the defeat of the Aztec Empire. Of course, this excuse is questionable. It's a Spanish record of history. But it's the same quality of historic records we have for almost all nation births 500 or 600 years ago. I mean, they were all questionable in terms of their bloodshed and so on. Cuitlahuac ruled for 80 days after replacing Montezuma. He died from new outbreaks of smallpox that had been introduced by an African who, ironically, was part of the Cuban expedition that Cortes captured. So, there was a vacuum. And this left Cortes and Doña Marina the ruling couple of Mexico. But Marina's own people And subsequent Mexican history would refer to her as La Malinche, a name that insinuates and to many simply means traitor. And it's a name that is stuck even to today. But fate seemed to favor the entire expedition again. And as conquistador, Cortes still tried to live up to the rules of engagement given to him by his superiors in Cuba. Spanish blood would continue to mix with the natives for many years under Cortes's rule. How much of it was voluntary, no one will ever know. But it happened as nature would have it happen. Interracial coupling and domesticity, despite one culture dominating the other. Cortes and Doña Marina had a child, and many historians consider their son, his name Martin Cortes, the first Mexican. Interesting young man, actually. He wore and assumed both cultures publicly, displaying his multicultural parentage. He spoke Spanish and native languages, befriended and associated with native peers, and he dressed only in native fashion. It appears he understood his unique role as a symbol of the future of this new national character. But both he and his mother have been relegated to an antiquity Mexicans wish to forget or ignore or simply disavow, even though with the defeat of Montezuma, a modern Mexico burst dramatically onto the stage, never to be reversed. All this took place over a period of about 24, 25 years, from 1521 to 1546, the year before Cortes died. In Mexico today, there are no streets, sites, or monuments to Cortes, or to his illustrious mistress, a brilliant woman in impossible circumstances. There is just a handful of minor representations and references. The mysterious near life-size monument of Cortes, Doña Marina, and their son, Martin. It was buried somewhere in fall down so that no one could even see it. And it was pretty much life-size. It was a huge monument. Not that far removed from the Lincoln Monument. But it was buried in garbage and fall down. Small bust of Cortes is in Mexico City, and a painting of him in Marina by famed Mexican artist Jose Orozco was from 1926, which is quite a while later. And then there's a rundown old building called Casa de Cortes, a place of no history in which Cortes never lived. No one knows how it came by its name. Further to this honors vacuum, there's an imposing, even regal, 500-year-old stone house still standing in Coyoacan, the district of Mexico City. Doña Marina once lived there, arguably as an Aztec princess. And yet there is no plaque or indicator of any kind to mark the spot as historic, even as many throughout history have called her the mother of her country. Further, the extraordinary love story behind this couple held no particular interest in Mexican history, literature, or anthropology. What has stuck: Cortes had a reputation for greed and exploitation. His armies plundered where they could, and in polite terms, speed dated the indigenous women. Cortes was also accused of killing hundreds of thousands of innocent native people, which of course is or can be considered a genocide. And so the name Cortes would become Mexico's vulnerable C word. Dismissed historically as an unknown in a nation he literally founded. In contrast, one will still find national parks, streets, bridges, schools, statues, sports stadiums, civics groups, sports teams, and even brands of beer, bearing the names Montezuma, even Twain, who ruled for only a few days, really. The other side of this coin is, interesting too, because it brings about the bewildering ambiguity. The fact that Cortes and Doña Marina ended the brutality of human sacrifices. These were between 20,000 and 250,000 per year. Now, this is according to reputable scholars over the years. The actual numbers are really elusive and not known. But at the very least, we know that it did happen in large numbers. And then there was cannibalism. 16th century reports of the practice came from several areas. Spanish explorers experienced cannibalism firsthand. One of Cortes's eventual translators, Geronimo de Aguilar, watched and recorded the realistic consumption of 4 of his shipwrecked companions. It was an Aztec tradition of eating their war captives. All of this, too, is part of Mexico's origin story. The great Mexican writer Octavio Paz wrote that the Mexicans' ultimate rejection of Cortes and his mistress as Mexico's origin story left them in a state of orphanhood. This orphanhood has puzzled Mesoamerican anthropologists and historians for centuries. On the one hand, Mexico proudly acknowledges its Indian ancestry. On the other, it clearly prizes its Spanish heritage as a modern symbol of status. Cortes and his misunderstood mistress, interpreter, diplomat, Marina, brought together 2 worlds by their extraordinary efforts and also by the glamour of their romantic and heroic coupling. As a result, neither culture died and neither totally transcended, leaving Mexicans to continue to question their identity. Is it modern or ancient, Spanish or native, victor or conquered? Or is it just both? As an interesting take on this split national psyche, Mexican-American poet Gloria Anzaldúa wrote that Mexicans today have learned a tolerance for contradictions, a tolerance for ambiguity, particularly in the realm of race and culture. They call it mestizaje. The word attempts to capture the sense of tension created by interbreeding and racial and cultural mixing. But history tells us very few origin stories need to be beneficent and inspirational, and most were not. Usually they were cleaned up for presentation to the world by the conquerors. This was worldwide. We all know that. And today I believe they simply need to be they need to be understood for their time and their worldview and the history that preceded them. By analogy, the cultural and ethnic convergence of Saxon and Norman has proven the merits of that convergence and the great future it would produce. Something grander and richer, I argue, than if the conjoining had never occurred. The Brits and the French would, I have little doubt, agree. Further, Europeans who came to North America were often just as insensitive to indigenous peoples, and yet heroes emerged in their historical record. It's an age-old perk of conquest. For me, this Cortes Marina story, which to many reaches the level of operatic drama, with all its romantic and tragic threads, is one of the most unique in world history. Mexican nationalists denigrated their European heritage and demonized the conquerors, and regrettably, the portrayal of the brilliant Doña Marina. Mexicans have fashioned a peculiar concept that carries on even today. Referring to Marina, they call it malinchismo, which means the betrayal of one's own. Anthropologists note that malinchismo became an unwitting principle, resulting in anathema for modern Mexicans to prefer the company of foreigners and their outlandish ways over their own native peoples and cultures. So be careful and be nice. At Mexico's 500th anniversary, Senator Jesus Rodriguez defended La Malinche, calling her a brave woman in an adverse situation who, contrary to what has been said about her, cannot be described as a traitor. Similarly, the newspaper Reforma reported around the same time, La Malinche has been treated unfairly by history. And I agree. Cortes was lavishly honored in Spain, even though he died in financial debt in Mexico. The reputational downgrading began after his death in 1547 in Mexico, the land he may have considered his real home. Mexican historians cast the Spanish as ruthless interlopers, culminating today in Mexico's president asking Spain last year for reparations. Cortes's remains are in Mexico City Hospital, as it was his wish, and are marked by a discreet plaque that would require a guide to find. Malinche would eventually be dropped as his mistress and married off to a general for the sake of propriety when Cortes's real wife, Catalina, arrived in Mexico a year after the formal conquest. Is that television stuff or what? So Mexico's identity story is a lesson for today's world. Of course there are things that are universally bad, regardless of the era in which they occurred. But is it fair to evaluate all past history and historical figures with the mindsets, mores, and values of today without considering the anachronistic nature of these judgments? This presentism or revisionism may be why we are so hungry for heroes to follow today. Political strongmen, to comic book supermen, to video game monsters. Fair or not? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, this is the question and answer period. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and if you can belt it out, you can do so. Otherwise, I will come around and you can tell me, and I can belt it out. So who has a question? And I could imagine there might be some controversial questions. Completely satisfied? And we got a half question. We got a half ready. Stand and belt it for me.
Well, you'll all hear me. Every weekend, we seem to be invaded by the Tapatillos. Many of the Tapatillos that come here are fair-skinned, lean, and seemingly consider themselves a class above the bulk of the Mexicans who are mestizos. Would you agree with that or not?
Do I agree? It's a political issue, but do I agree that they consider themselves a notch above the working class? Well, again, it's a difficult question to answer because in some ways they deserve to be, they deserve the respect of having built their life one notch above the working class. On the other hand, yes, I have seen some indications of a certain arrogance, but this arrogance does exist in other countries as well. Once you move from one so-called class, stage, or layer in society, and you move up to a higher level and you live in a bigger house and have a better car and all of that, yeah, you're going to be a little cocky. I know I experienced it where I came from, but yes, there is some of what you say. I think most people might agree that does occur. But it's universal, David. You know that.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so your position on the world conquest seems pretty...
Louder, please.
I'll repeat it. I'll repeat
Your
it.
position on the conquest of Spain, Mexico, seems very halfway, right? You seem partially like you agreed with it, but yet you still saw the negative side of it. And I'm kind of wondering whether you feel that it was right in the sense that, yes, it created the culture that exists today, or wrong in the sense that it did require the Spanish to conquer literally almost all of Mexico in order for them to be satisfied with the similar...
I don't think I can repeat this. You got to bring this to the...
Or whether you are on the side...
Are you for or against the...
The idea of the time was like for Britain example, was make the world Britain, right? And Spain obviously had the same idea of make the world Spain, right? Hence New Spain.
Okay, I've got to stop you.
So your question is, what is your
Do you
question?
see it as wrong? As a full wrong?
Was the conquest wrong?
Is the conquest wrong? Imperialism and ethnic superiority is absolutely wrong, and it's still going on in the world today. I tried to point that out. I was trying to give both sides of the story, but I am leaning toward a review of Cortes and Doña Marina's contribution to the world that we see today.
Right, they're villainized.
Yes, exactly. And so I'm trying to say, is it fair to just dismiss them out of hand completely? That's why I tried to mention the only representations of them, the only honors that they got were garbage. And so I felt that this was maybe a bit unfair. Now, having said that, at the beginning of the presentation I said this is a movie. And I see it as a movie. I see it as a very romantic story because of this particularly because of this young woman, brilliant as she was. If she was not around, there's a good chance Cortes would not have succeeded in kind. I haven't said that because I don't think it's fair for me to make those judgments, but I'm not sure Cortes would have conquered Mexico if it wasn't for Doña Marina.
Maybe that's why they call her a traitor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly. So it's really a woman's world here.
Oh, man. We're hoping for it. Stephen, you want to stand up and help?
Yeah, I'd like more of a comment than a question. And that is that we must recognize that, as in many cases throughout history, the story or the screenplay that you're describing was written by the Spanish.
Was written by the Spanish, yeah.
I don't know if you heard him. He's saying we must recognize and appreciate that the story was written by the Spanish. The story being told today is written by the Spanish, by Ed.
Yeah, the entire history that we have is an interpretation.
Yes. I think I noted that.
The story is an
that
interpretation.
These were records, based on Spanish records and on a Spanish, I guess you call him a journalist who accompanied Cortes, and Cordoba. He came with Cordoba, and if I'm not mistaken, he stayed in the Yucatan and lived among the tribes. His name was Bernal, I can't remember his last name, but he was a journalist and was still there when Cortes came. So yes, you're right about it being a Spanish story.
Gentleman over here, can you stand up, sir?
Is there a Mexican Howard Zinn who has written an honest history of Mexico?
Is there a Mexican somebody who is working?
Howard Zinn.
Howard Zinn? Howard Zinn.
Howard
Howard Zinn?
No.
Z-I-N-N, Zinn.
Zinn.
Z-I-N-N, Zen.
Zinn. Is there a Mexican Howard Zinn who has written this story?
Howard Zinn wrote the people's history of the United States. So he wrote it from the point of view of women and the Indians and the oppressed. So it's a
Instead of the white
progressive-
man?
It's a progressive view of history. Is there anyone like that that wrote the history of what
I
you
think
spoke
Stephen's
about?
raising his hand. He's a multicultural linguist, can speak.
I have had the advantage of studying some of this. Actually, the Spanish, especially the Spanish priesthood, the missionaries, the Franciscans and Dominicans, they did teach many natives Spanish. And eventually, some of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren began to tell the stories that they had learned from their children, from their ancestors, and began to write the history from that perspective.
Yes, that's true.
Do we have a name of a book?
Yes.
Anybody can recommend?
The name
We
of
have,
the book-
we have stuff in our library.
The name of the book is The Fifth Son.
The Fifth Son. Anybody here read that? Yes. We gotta wrap it up, but okay.
Just another reference. A woman, Helen Highsmith Gordon, wrote a book on Donna Maria back in the 80s, I believe, that was just excellent, and also from the perspective of being a woman of that time, and from Donna Maria's perspective, as opposed to just the Spanish.
Well,
Any last words before I?
what was the question? Was there a question?
No, she just telling about another book, another from a perspective of women, sharing information.
Based on what I have read and what I know, I believe the woman was a genius, having learned all these languages and having become the key player in that whole conquest. If I failed to bring that across, then that's my
No,
fault.
you didn't, I think you brought it across. That's just the other controversy. Okay, this was good, all right?